Simon is ultimately a name of Hebrew origins, coming from roots meaning to hear and listen. In Hebrew, the name was originally Shimon, before becoming Simon in Greek, and ultimately giving us the English form of the name we all know today. Famous Simons include the likes of actor and writer Simon Pegg, liberator Simon Bolivar, YouTuber/dwarf Simon Lane, in-betweener Simon Bird, and awful human being Simon Cowell, to just name a few. It can also appear as a last name too, with the likes of singer-songwriter Paul Simon and Captain America co-creator Joe Simon. There's a whole plethora of Simons out there, but for many of us, this name isn't mostly linked to someone with the name Simon, but instead most heard in the name of a beloved kids game. Simon Says is one of those timeless games that kids and grown-ups have been playing for years now. It's simple, easy to follow, can be played anywhere, and doesn't require any additional equipment. All you need is a group of people and one of them to be the Simon of the game. The one running things gives commands to the rest of the group, normal simple things like them to put their hands in the air or hopping on one leg and so on. For every command they give, they'll preempt it with the titular Simon Says, e.g. Simon says close your eyes, Simon says open your mouth, Simon says raise your hands, and so on. However, when the person given commands doesn't say Simon Says at the start of the command and just says jump around, then you don't do the thing, and if you do it, you're out. It's a really simple little game which gets kids moving and paying attention. Many may be more familiar with the electronic game of Simon, which came into being in the US in the late 1970s. This version has you repeating the button presses the machine tells you to. It's actually just called Simon and not Simon Says, but it is named directly after the other game. It was really the bop it of its time. The non-electrical OG version of Simon Says, however, is still very popular, and thanks to this, the name Simon has been uttered countless times in playgrounds and classrooms around the world. It makes sense why the name of this game makes reference to a human given name. It's all about listening to commands and paying attention when a part of that command is missing. Using a given name as the removable part of the command people have to listen out to makes all the sense in the world. But why, out of every name on our planet, was the name Simon chosen for this game? And this isn't meant to be a dig at people named Simon, it's a cool name. But why does it appear in the game's name? Was there once upon a time a real Simon who shouted commands to his underlings that they all keenly followed and didn't listen to a word he said if he didn't preempt it with his own name? Well, maybe. We know that the name Simon dates back to Hebrew and is rather old, but the game itself, however, isn't quite as old. The earliest written evidence we have of the game dates to the 25th of April in 1842, which granted is just under 200 years ago at this point, which is quite a long time ago, but in the grand scheme of history, that was practically yesterday. It appears in the Boston Morning Post, a local paper in the Massachusetts city. It appears in a miscellaneous column called All Sorts of Paragraphs and reads as, Simon is a great talker. Sometimes he says up, sometimes he says down, and sometimes he says wiggle waggle. It's always cheapest to do as Simon Says. This paragraph is seemingly nonsensical, so it might seem weird to find in a newspaper, but back then we didn't have the internet, let alone memes, so people needed to get their nonsense gibberish out somewhere, right? What this shows us, however, is that by 1842, the game Simon Says had been around for long enough to make reference to it in a nonsensical article, meaning we can assume the game originated sometime prior to the mid-19th century. The Simon in this game's name, however, is thought to date back to way before the 19th century. We have multiple theories who the Simon in Simon Says is. One idea is that it comes from St. Peter. Now, obviously there's a slight issue here. He's St. Peter and not St. Simon. While he is more commonly known as Peter today, he was actually known as Simon Peter or even just Simon back in the day. According to Wikipedia, his birth name was Shimon bar Yonah. This guy was undoubtedly a Simon. Why the game used his name is all down to the role this Simon/Peter played in the crucifixion of Jesus. On the day of his crucifixion, Peter famously told people he did not know Jesus, which led to Jesus' death. When Jesus was resurrected, he asked Peter once again if he knew who he was, and Peter admitted he did. This led to the idea of Peter/Simon saying things that don't reflect his actions, which ties in neatly with the mechanics of the game Simon Says. Another theory behind the Simon in this game relates to someone who's actually way more known under the name of Simon, that being one Simon de Montfort, the 6th Earl of Leicester. Leicester is of course a city in England, but that doesn't mean this Simon was English. He was actually a French native born in 1208. He was born into French nobility and arrived on the shores of England in 1229. He had an upper hand in England, as not only was he from noble roots like then King Henry III, but also went on to marry the king's younger sister, making the two in-laws. Relations between Simon and Henry III were good to start off with, yet for various reasons the relationship between the two of them soured, which led him to rebelling against the king. Simon became renowned for his military leadership, fierce command, and brutality. He was able to imprison King Henry III and for around the year being the highest power in all of England. Not king, but ruled over one of the first parliaments in the country. The foundations he lay is seen as being on the earliest versions of the modern Parliament of the UK. Suffice to say, this Simon was quite a big deal in England's past. As said, he was incredibly brutal and commanding. He held more authority than the actual king for some time. People did pretty much anything he would say out of fear and respect. From this, it's easy to understand why it's widely believed that Simon de Montfort is thought to be the Simon in the game of Simon Says. Yet there's another theory, and this one claims that Simon is someone who was around way before de Montfort and even St. Peter/Simon. In fact, his name wasn't even Simon. This claims that the game of Simon Says unto itself doesn't date to the mid-19th century, but instead from the time of ancient Rome. Apparently, when the Romans weren't raging wars, building roads, or assassinating one another, they were busy playing a game similar to the one we know today. Yet instead of it being called Simon Says, they called it Cicero dicit fac hoc, which translates into meaning Cicero says do this. Cicero in this title refers to one Marcus Tullius Cicero, famous orator and politician in ancient Rome, famed for his way with words. He was deeply respected during his time, so it makes sense why people would obey what he had to say, and it's understandable why his name would be used for this game. And likewise, it's easy to see how Cicero would morph into Simon in the English-speaking world. The names sound pretty similar to one another. This gives us three contenders as to who the Simon in Simon Says truly is. It's either follower of Jesus, St. Peter/Simon, ruler of England for a brief spell Simon de Montfort, or Roman orator Cicero. So which of these three truly take the cake as being the Simon in Simon Says? Well, honestly, I don't think it's any of them. There's such little evidence to actually back up any of these claims. All the sources I got this information from had no further evidence to really back them up. They simply exclaimed them to be true and carried on with their days. The St. Peter theory I found on one Wikipedia page, and even there they said it was highly unlikely to be true. The Simon de Montfort theory seems to be the most popular, but even there, despite people writing about it, it doesn't really seem to go any deeper. Likewise, people mentioned the Roman origins, but I just found it super unlikely. There's no Roman accounts of the game, and the earliest evidence we have of it in any way comes from the 19th century. Surely at some point in around the 2000-year period between the death of Cicero and the 19th century, someone would have mentioned it somewhere, right? All three of these theories all have the trappings of a folk etymology. Folk etymologies are made-up word origins, usually created after the fact. They mostly come into being as neat stories, or even as a way to project views of certain people onto others. We have a whole video about them. If you know anything about folk etymologies, you can just tell that these give off the same vibes as many others. For some reason, folk etymologies often involve royalty or other noteworthy people from the past, and that's the case with all three of these. As someone who's looked into the origin of names and words for almost 10 years now, I feel these explanations are made up stories from years gone by, created as fun tales to tell kids or down the pub. In reality, there's probably a really simple explanation as to why this game is called Simon Says, and it has nothing to do with a real Simon either. The name probably just comes from the fact that Simon Says is a fun piece of alliteration. Kids enjoy alliteration and they tend to be fun to say, so it makes sense why it would become the name for a game kids play which revolve around listening to the correct commands. Sure, it's not the funnest origin, but it's probably the most realistic. Of course, there's a chance that they aren't folk etymologies, and Simon Says it really does originate with someone actually named Simon. A real Simon who was deeply respected and people did everything he asked of them. But then again, if that's the case, then surely the entire world would respect this singular Simon, right? This isn't the case, as different names and titles are used in the game's name around the world. In French, the game is called Jacques a dit, which means Jacques said. In German, it's Commandor Pimperel, which roughly translates into being Pimperel's commands, with this being the name of an old puppet character from the past. And in Portuguese, it's O Leomanda, which means the king's orders. Many languages, meanwhile, do use the name Simon, or at least their translation of the name, like Simone in Italian, Simon in Ukrainian, or Szymon in Polish. Let me know what name your language goes with for this game down below. What this all means is that whoever Simon is, even if that is his real name, we all seem to be insistent on obeying his every command. Speaking of which, Simon Says subscribe and go spot Name Explain on Patreon for like $1,000 a month or something. Hey, it was worth a shot, right? Name Explain depends on viewers like yourself supporting the channel financially on Patreon, so a huge thank you to everyone who does. Donating just $1 a month helps the channel amazingly and gets you bonuses including ad-free videos, exclusive content, the power to request ideas to be made into actual Name Explain videos, and your name at the end of the video with all these awesome people. Visit patreon.com/Name Explain or click the link down below to find out how you too can support the channel. Thank you. Thanks for reaching the end of the video. Why not watch another and subscribe to keep up to date on all things Name Explain. You can find myself on Instagram where I'm NameExplainYT, and join the Facebook group Friends of Name Explain to talk with myself and other name nerds. All that will be linked down below. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and once again, thank you all so much.